Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the path between primary and secondary worlds. I'm Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. We've recently begun our first free book study, our first free book club, and based off a patron vote, we've been going through Augustine's Confessions. Now, we've only met at this point for our first meeting. Our next one is going to be, the 12th, May 12th at 9 p.m., and then every other Monday at that point until we finish the Confessions. And so if you want to join in moving forward, you're more than welcome to do so. On our next meeting on the 12th, we'll be covering books 3 and 4. And so if you just want to catch up and join us for that meeting, you're more than welcome to do so. All you need to do is sign on Patreon at patreon.com/mythicmind. You can sign on as a free member. You can sign on as a paid member. Payment is not required. It's always appreciated to send a few bucks my way to help me just continue doing this sort of thing and all the various things I'm doing through Mythic Mind. But again, it's not necessary at all. All you need to do is just enroll because that's where information will be put out there, including the Zoom link. If you want to join us, just go to patreon.com/mythicmind. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and provide you with that first conversation that we had. And so let's go ahead and get right to it. So, we can go ahead and get started here talking about Augustine's Confessions. Now, is anybody here reading it for the first time? Okay, Chase. All right. I know Chase has been on an incredible literary journey for the last little while here, reading all kinds of amazing books. You need to launch off on your own podcast or something. I'm sure you've got some things to say. Um, well, I've been reading this book for a number of years. I mean, since I was in seminary doing my master's degree, which was like it's crazy to think that was I don't know how many like over a decade ago. I've been in school so long, it's hard to keep track of where one thing ended and another thing began. But this was, in many ways, like the beginning of my real literary journey and my love of reading. Um, that especially when it comes to narrative, comes to fiction, like I didn't read a lot of fiction, and this isn't fiction, but it is very much narrative based. It's kind of the his own spiritual autobiography here, and it just resonated with me so much as this philosophically inclined individual just wrestling with ideas, wrestling with the flesh, and finding his way in many ways finding that he's being brought along his way to Christ. And just so much of that resonated with me that it really did begin my love of books, my love of reading, my love of narratives in general, whether it be fiction or nonfiction. And so the special book to me, I did just recently for the first time read the Sheed translation, which I love this translation. I'd been reading the Penguin up until now, which I mean that's fine as well, although I've been informed by the great books guys that that's not so great. So in summary, this is something that's been near and dear to me for a while, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. All right, Chase, I got to start with you just since you're reading it fresh. What are your initial thoughts, just kind of wherever first impressions?
Oh man, this is great so far. Very much can tell like Boethius pulled was influenced by this work, for sure, and just so much just insight and how you can see that how his mind was working and wrestling with different uh, sins that he had throughout his whole life. Um, yeah, it's been awesome so far.
Good. Yeah, Augustine's one of those figures that moderns like to diagnose as if he had like something wrong with him from the way that he obsesses over his sin, right? They do the same thing to Luther. They try to diagnose him with some kind of psychological condition because he was so apparently obsessive over his own sin. He treated every small little thing, as this, incident with the pears in his youth. Like he treats that as such a enormous thing, but I think what we really see if we read honestly, we see somebody who just has learned to love holiness, and out of his love for holiness, he has a just hatred for sin, beginning with himself. I mean, he talks about he's got a line in here where he basically says, we are our own worst enemy, that it is our displeasure with God that is going to do us the greatest harm. And so he treats that with utmost seriousness, the same way that we would likely treat some of our enemies, recognizing that we are misplacing that label in the most primary sense. Um, and so, yeah, I agree that he, just from the very beginning, I mean, it's just this um, powerful intermingling of philosophy and existential concerns, which for him are one and the same. Um, cool. All right. What about let's see. I know some of you said you read it before. Randall, have you read this before?
I've read parts of it. It's been a long time ago, and I just found out about this like 2 days ago, so I have not caught up yet. But what I do remember is just like being surprised, and maybe this was partly translation, but just surprised at like how modern it felt, like it could have been written 5 years ago or something.
Yeah, yeah, and just the genre is definitely very unique. I mean, it's been approached as like an early form of depth psychology, like how Augustine gets so in detail with his own internal thoughts, and it's a way that really does make it stand out largely from the kinds of things you get in the ancient world. In that sense, it does read as a very modern, almost existentialist kind of text. Like the way that he writes is not entirely different from someone like Kierkegaard. And in fact, I almost made my doctoral dissertation on the intersections between Kierkegaard and Augustine until I unfortunately came across a book that already did what I wanted to do, which is one of the worst things when you're doing research to find out that someone else has already done what you want to do, and then you got to go find some other niche. But yeah, so it is definitely a modern kind of text in that sense. At least it seems like it is. All right. Um, well. I guess I will. We'll kind of run this how we've done some of our other book studies. I'm just going to kick us off with a thought from early on, and then we'll just kind of go around with whatever stood out to you. We'll start off with book one, and then we'll move on to book two. But for me, one of the things I appreciate is just right at the very beginning that we see that first and foremost, this book is a conversation with God, or it's oriented toward God. I mean, what you'd expect from a book called The Confessions, right? That he is confessing his soul, he's confessing his sins, he's really confessing all that he is before God, and in kind of orienting himself toward God, he's able to better understand himself, and in understanding himself, he's able to more authentically engage with God, and so this is back and forth connection. It's like Calvin said that, all knowledge comes to knowledge of self and knowledge of God. Um, and I mean, sorry, I go Reformation. Let me stick to the text. All right. So we started off showing us that this is an orientation toward God first and foremost. And also, Augustine says, so great art thou, O Lord, and greatly to be praised. Great is thy power, and of thy wisdom there is no number. And man desires to praise thee. He is but a tiny part of all that thou hast created. And so there's this emphasis on our place within the broader story. And so that sense, it's a very much a not a modern text in that this um, there's a stark contrast between pre-modern and postmodern philosophy, where the pre-moderns, where they're talking about the medieval Christians, and Augustine he's usually categorized as early medieval, late Christian antiquity, but whether we're talking about the medievals, whether we're talking about the ancient pagans, there's this prevailing idea that we are born into a story, and the path of virtue, the path of fulfillment, the path of fulfilling what we are meant for is in finding our place within this broader story of reality. That's in direct contrast to what we get with really the moderns and especially the postmoderns, where we start to get this move to not how do I contextualize myself within reality, but how do I contextualize reality within myself. I teach like a million different places, but on campus, I teach with philosophy with a state university. And this is something that I'm always dealing with my students and helping them to understand the postmodern climate that they've lived in without even really realizing it. The stark contrast between how do I find my place within capital R reality versus the postmodern idea of how do I create reality? How do I contextualize everything into myself. And so I appreciate that outward orientation because it provides so much more hope because now we actually have somewhere to go. We can talk about progress in a meaningful sense because we actually start somewhere and we can actually move somewhere. Which, again, contrasts with what we get in like Lewis's Great Divorce, where he conceptualizes, hell as this radical isolation, which really is his commentary on the postmodern condition. And so even as Augustine is going on and on about how terrible of a sinner he is and how awful he is and how he's nothing but for grace, like it sounds rather dismal. And to the postmodern perspective, it sounds almost diagnosable. But at the same time, once you actually understand what Augustine's doing, it becomes it opens up the possibility of actual purpose, actual freedom, actual getting somewhere. It allows us to receive rather than constantly create at all times. And so, just from the very orientation that he's engaging in, it provides a strong corrective to our postmodern mindset, which is actually very liberating to me. So, there's my initial thought. We can kind of just go wherever things have to move here. Um, would anyone like to volunteer, just kind of share some thoughts wherever you want to go with this from book one? Yeah, Ian, thank you.
I read this back in high school, and I've always really appreciated Augustine because he's so God centered, and Confessions is, I mean, from the opening lines, it's all about God and comparing our worthlessness with God's greatness and the grace that He lifts us to be with Himself. I thought, especially when I was reading the second chapter that we're reading for today, 1 and 2, when he talks about loving Virgil and struggling with Homer because of Greece, um, it feels to me like he's really taking that opening hero muse and singing a tale, and he's converting that to a Christian perspective, and that really struck me this time. So I really liked that part of his classical pagan education being baptized into the Christian world.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting that. That he on one hand he very much criticizes the way that he approached the pagan poets, in his past. How he learned to mourn, but not for himself. He learned to participate in the play, but not to recognize kind of his own narrative. And so he has very much criticizes the poets, and he even says like. Who was Aeneas? Like I didn't even know who I was. And so, on one hand, he takes some shots at the classics, at least a wrong approach to the classics. But at the same time, in his confessions, in his own meditations, he'll sometimes quote Virgil. You can see that if you have a translation or if you have an edition that has notes, reference notes, footnotes. Sometimes he'll be quoting the classics, and so he's not against the classics, but he very much is against approaching the classics from an unbaptized perspective, as he is with anything, that there is no good apart from God. And so if we are going to approach anything as good apart from God, then well, we're severing it from the very font of goodness. And so it does have somewhat thing of a complex relationship with the classics, but I agree that he definitely appreciates their baptized potential. Um, I did think that I don't know. Sometimes I felt like he went a little bit too hard on fiction for my taste. I'm not down with all of what he said at that level. Yeah, Ian, go ahead.
Sorry, I get my mute button mixed up. I think that we have to remember what kind of fictions Augustine would have available to him. He didn't have a Lewis or a Tolkien. He didn't have a history of Christian literature like Jane Austen and Shakespeare and Charles Dickens. He was the beginning of the Christian tradition of literature. And before him, you have stuff like Apuleius's The Golden Ass, which I read in college, and that is foul. It is very disgusting depictions of women having sex with acid, like donkeys. It's just despicable, and you can see why Augustine would be like, "Yeah, I think fiction has a real danger of getting you sucked into these perversions and being enamored of the wrong parts of the world." So I think that's part of where he comes from in the literature. I mean, I did an English major in college, so I'm not against literature, but I think thinking about the context and what he had available, he didn't have those those myths that he could reach to that didn't point towards evil in some way.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very fair point. And even looking at his context in still moving against paganism, like there's still these very pagan influences. We tend to view pagan literature as literature rather than first and foremost as paganism. And so, someone like Lewis can look from this kind of late modern period that he lived in, and he can look back and recognize some virtues in paganism that modernism has largely lost, right? He can find the good there and find that there are things that are worth recovering. Whereas Augustine is still very much in the midst of things. Operating in Carthage, operating in Rome, and so it does make sense that he would have a lot more hesitancy toward those sorts of things that are still very much alive and breathing. That is a very good point. Um, yeah, Chase.
I was just going to say, I agree with Ian there, and you, because I think it was even in the intro, it was talking about how like promiscuity at that point wasn't even seen like as any kind of bad thing at all, like compared to like even in his view, compared to like everything else. Like his friend that was the bishop was like cheering on blood sport basically with the crowd. And you're like, yeah, I can see if basically all the entertainment, which is what I'm sure he would see fiction as, would have been kind of not, honoring to God and not worthy of anyone's time, especially if you found so much like enjoyment in the lewd plays as a young guy.
Yeah, he talks about how in the pagan myths, the kinds of things that Zeus did, for example, or Jove. He says that these are the things that people would look to and basically find a way to justify or even deify their basest desires and say, "Oh, I'm like the gods." I mean, who am I to judge Jove here? And so he takes Homer to bat here, and says that so much of the pagan myths are just an attempt to just do that, to deify our base desires. And I mean, to be fair, I mean he's got something to say there. Good. Yeah. I mean, what else? I mean, someone jump in here. I mean, I can kind of scan through my notes, but
I really like how you mentioned the conversationality of the confessions. And actually, I was looking for it, but I couldn't find it. But I wrote a paper on this semester for that, actually, the on that exact same topic. And it was really interesting to see. He's literally having a conversation with God, and in this conversation, Augustine is steeped in the Bible itself. He's quoting the Psalms, a lot of the Psalms, other places too, but he's quoting the Psalms all over the place, right? So, and other things as well. But it's just really interesting, and he's not afraid to ask God questions. Um, it's almost comical in a sense in what I've seen, because like you see, it's like a little kid asking their father, like, "Did the heaven and earth then contain you? Like, since do you feel it? You know what I'm talking about? You guys have the same question. It's really interesting. He's not afraid to do that. Not afraid at all."
yeah, he has a very humble, I mean, childlike kind of approach. Understood in the best possible framing of that idea that he is constantly asking God the kinds of things that we take for granted. I mean, like, we might pray, God fill me, or I mean, people will talk about God like coming into their heart or whatever. Like, what does that even mean? Right? God is everywhere. That you don't have existence without God. And so, what does that mean? Where is God traveling to? And so, Augustine is just kind of debating with himself over the relationship that God has to space, to physicality, to location. Um, and we're going to see that as his intellectual journey continues, this is going to be something that he really wrestled with of how does an immaterial God even make sense? I mean, this is one of the reasons why the Romans called the early Christians atheists, because they talked about a transcendent, invisible God, and it's like that wasn't they didn't have a category for that, and so they just assumed that Christians were actually in reality just denying all gods, and so they had the charge of atheism. So Augustine, very classically trained here, he very much struggled with that. And so as he sort of works through that, and as he has conversion, first of intellect and then of spirit, that um, he just continues to marvel in these basic things that, he once struggled so deeply with. And I think that there's something just so healthy about that. If you've been a Christian for a while, whether you have a formal theological education or not, like you think you understand a lot more than you probably do. And I very much have learned this, with my twin 3-year-olds when they ask me questions. And I'll give an answer and then ask a follow-up, and I realize I don't really know how to explain this, probably because I don't understand it myself. And so yeah, Augustine definitely has that spirit about him. I mean, I love how like later on, he'll be going through his meditations here and then just kind of almost randomly just say like, but what is time? And just sort of go off. Like he thinks very much the way that I do, and he just has such a wonder about everything because he recognizes that all things, all true things, come from God. Therefore, all true things are infinitely wondrous. And as Aquinas would say, years later after this, that um, that all the efforts of the human mind cannot exhaust the essence of a single fly. And I think that we see that same wonder very much at play with Augustine. Good.
Yeah, just even the very start where he's talking about the line, "For thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee." Which is going through the whole first book, and I guess the second book too, is just like, I've been a Christian my whole life, but until I made it later in my like mid 20s, like I didn't really take it as seriously, and especially the last 2 years, I've learned so much that I didn't know. Just like you were saying, like we you think you know a lot, and you think you know everything about it, that you're like realize, if like babies are inherently sinful, like how does a baby sin? And then he even goes into that, which was awesome.
Yeah, maybe we should talk about the babies. So yeah, go ahead. What were you gonna say, Jeremiah?
No, joking. Augustine hates babies. No, that's a common thing I get. I get the common
Well,
refrain.
so does Augustine hate babies?
I don't think so.
I
I
think
like
Augustine.
it.
I
Go
think
ahead.
Augustine kind of overreacted to his sexual sin in his youth, by kind of over embracing the ideal of celibacy and virginity. And I think it's, to me, it's psychologically understandable, but I do think that it was not balanced with what you see in the whole Bible. I think he maybe pulled on some of the Apostle Paul's statements about being single a bit too hard instead of focusing on the creation order of Adam and Eve and the redemption of that in Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. That he yeah, he definitely had a big problem with sexual sin, leading up to his heart conversion, really. I mean, we're going to find that, he had a concubine for quite a while, which was just common practice. And so I mean, he just that was his chief failing, really, before his conversion, chief sin that he struggled with. And yeah, I mean, it's reasonable to say that maybe he argued against that, or he reacted to that perhaps a little bit too much on a dogmatic level rather than strictly existential. Um, Now, as far as the baby thing, that okay, babies cry because they're selfish, essentially. I don't know that I buy that. I'm with him theologically that we are born into sin, that we have a sin nature that naturally disorders our desires. At the same time, like babies need stuff and they can't talk. I feel like we could have a rather simple, common sense kind of response to some of that. I feel like he gets a little bit excessive. I don't know. Does anyone want to defend his rebuke of babies? Yeah, go ahead, Chase.
I mean, I just thought the line where he says, uh, "Thus the innocence of children is in the helpless of their bodies rather than inequality in their minds. I've myself seen a baby jealous. It was too young to speak, but it was livid with anger as it watched another infant at the breast. And like, yeah, it could also be hungry, but I don't know. I feel like there are kids that kind of do something when they see another kid, and you're like, oh, that's like a little spark of just like you're not liking what you're getting there, you know? Um, so I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. And I'm not somebody who thinks that kids are innocent. I have three of them now. And so I'm not somebody who thinks that kids are innocent. That there's definitely that sinful nature there. And it's just I don't know. I think it's hard to delineate what's sinful versus like babies need stuff and they can't talk. Like I feel like there is a very natural, and I mean natural in the sense in the positive sense of like in line with nature that like they need to communicate in the way that they can. And I don't know that frustration, like not being able to articulate what it is that you need. And this is for, I think, a baby or an adult, whether you can speak words or you can't do that yet, that I don't know that frustration itself is inherently sinful. But at the same time, we do have this natural bent towards sin, which I mean, I suppose is the most important aspect of what he's getting at here. But I don't know. I think he's a little bit too hard on babies, but I don't know. Maybe some could talk me out of that.
I think it's really interesting. He mentions like baptism, how it was deferred, and he directly asked God like, why was my baptism deferred? And of course, I know there's a whole bunch of ideas on baptism in the church today, and um, but yeah, as anyone, I'm sure some people are aware of the practice back then to wait until your deathbed and to get baptized.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and elaborate on that?
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah. So the the comment, I don't know if you can see me, I'm outside. But yeah, yeah. So there was a common thing because there's this idea that after your baptism, your sins were washed away, right? And you're dead with Christ. Now you rise again with Christ as well. But there's this other idea that your sins or the sins after that you need to basically like they only wash the sins you've done, not the ones that you do after. There's some ideas that basically there's more than that, but it's a big thing. So people would wait until their deathbed and to get baptized. They would wait. They'd be like, I'm on my deathbed, I'll get baptized, so I have more time to then have these sins washed away, which is a common thing.
Yeah, it's very yeah, like Constantine exactly. That
Yeah, yeah.
Constantine waited until his deathbed, and then he requested an Arian priest, which is kind of strange.
But
So
with Augustine, what's interesting is that because of that, and you see a little bit of it here, he says, "Why was my baptism delayed?" Augustine will later on rail against that idea and then argue for infant baptism.
yeah, but yeah, it's just kind of I don't know sad, but I mean obviously he recognizes this as disordered here when he says that as young I was sick and they were going to baptize me because they thought I might die. And then I got better, so they decided to push it back, just
Yeah,
to,
yeah. It's like, oh,
because
gotta
no,
wait.
right, no imminent need here. We don't want to give me a bath and I'm going to get dirty again anyways.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and then he even talks about his mom here, which I mean, Monica, his mother, is obviously a hero of his story here. But at the same time, he recognizes that she didn't always have the best priorities at heart. Like when he was young and gallivanting around, and he says that basically she should have encouraged me to just get married, but she didn't because she was worried about how that would impact my career, and so she was pushing him in a certain direction as well. um and so she seems to me like somebody who um has a very lay kind of theology, even though a very sincere heart, and she was pivotal in his conversion. She kind of just embodies this common I don't know, almost I would say pagan kind of theology regarding stuff like the sacraments, where it's not, I don't know, they don't, it's about sort of magic rather than what you actually get in biblical sacramentalism. Right. Let him be wounded worse. He is not yet cured. Right. Welcome, Rach. Um, ha, so Yeah, thanks for popping in. Have you read this before, or is this?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not sure what time you actually started, whether I'm half an
It's
hour in or
fine.
just 5 minutes in. I'm in Australia, so I was like, what time is it there? I thought it was 11 here, but I think it might have been 10:30. But anyway, um, yes, I'm the one that commented on X that I sort of got about a third of the way through and then stopped. So I've read these books at least, although it was about 3 years ago.
Oh,
Um,
good.
and I've got the Sarah Rudin translation.
Okay, yeah, I haven't read that one. Yeah. So how's it going so far in this round?
Yeah, good. And a bit of crossover because I've just started Bible college this year. And so we're doing Christianity and history. And so we looked at Augustine and sort of we looked at the account of his conversion. So that was sort of interesting to read it in a different translator's words, I suppose.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's good. I enjoy, I don't know, sort of the insights as to his thinking about how he reflects on his childhood. Like when I look back to, I don't know, I can't remember much before being maybe 2 or 3 years old, but I still remember being I think maybe a 4 or 5 year old and deliberately hiding a coin so that mum would pay me my pocket money again. Um, and so like I knew the sinfulness of my heart when I was that young. So it's it's just funny to. I mean, I don't remember being breastfed, but maybe he has a brilliant memory. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah. There's some memories I'm glad to have forgotten. Um, the yeah. So you've got your own Pears incident. I mean, a little bit younger, but you know. Um, well, good. Glad to have you along from across the world here. Hey.
yeah,
Um, so another thing that I appreciate about Augustine is he very much has a kind of Platonic way of understanding, well, everything really. I mean, in fact, in City of God, he says that of all the philosophers, the Platonists come closer to us than anybody else, and so why do we even need to read anybody else? So he's very much intentionally trying to baptize Platonism here, and there a lot of passages here in his reflections toward God about how all goods ultimately come from God and are meant to lead us back to God. And sin really comes from a disordering of that relationship, where we treat things in isolation from God as if anything could be in isolation from God. And so, being itself, like existence itself, has a very deeply theological existential meaning for Augustine. And so, again, it's the kind of thing that some people will read Augustine and they think that he's too extreme and making everything so important. But again, if you actually believe the things he believes, if you believe the things that the Bible says, that, in him we live and move and have our being, that all things are made through the Logos and it's in him that all things are held together, then literally everything has significance. As as Calvin was said to have said, that there's not one color in this world, there's not one blade of grass that's not meant to make us rejoice. And you see that same impulse very much in Augustine, that somebody who, just is able to understand the negative isn't going to recognize that even in his framing of the negative, it's so full of joy at the goodness and the grace of God. And so he really does take this Platonic idea that all things are naturally oriented toward the good. He baptizes it, and I think that we get something just very, I don't know, very beautiful here in this exit return idea, which is going to become very important for Aquinas as well later on. This exit return, all things come from God, all things return to God. It's a very harmonious, very beautiful way of understanding what everything is, the life, the universe, and everything. Far more than 42. Someone throw something else out there. I could
Could
blabber
I,
on for a while, but
could I
yeah.
chime in with a question?
Mhm.
And I apologize. I have dogs in the background. If they get noisy, I'll cut the audio right away. I found it very interesting, and this is really kind of off the topic, but he did write about it, so I'll mention it.
Mhm.
Puts in here one place that he says if you ask basically an unlearned person if Aeneas went to Carthage, they would say, "Oh, I don't know." If you ask a scholarly person, he would say, "Most certainly not." And as I read that, I was trying to figure out, does he think that Aeneas wasn't a historical character, or is he talking about some high level of intellectual who at the time would say, "Oh, we know Aeneas was real, but he didn't actually go to Carthage"? My mind went down this rabbit trail because I had read the Aeneid, I guess, a year or so ago, and so it's still somewhat fresh in my mind. Did he have any belief in the historical accuracy of some of these Roman tales he was reading? Do we know?
I don't really know. I mean, based off the way that's framed, I tend to think that kind of much as is the case today, that he's taken shots at the learned for being, so critical in dismissing the myths is how I would understand that. Um, which again, this can be read as a very modern text. Um, that sometimes having being someone who's well learned can actually be that can be a liability regarding getting to the heart of the matter. It's the same problem of oh man, I'm just drawing a blank here. Um, I don't know. There are numerous problems of falling in love with your own intellect. This is Milton's approach to Satan. He fell in love with his own intellect essentially, um, and so yeah. So that's how I would understand this as a criticism of the high and learned more than anything else.
Well, it's definitely a modern problem too.
Yes, it most definitely is. Like, I mean, as I said, I teach on campus at a state university, and I I don't have a lot in common with my fellow humanities faculty. Uh, yeah, it's an interesting question. I'd like to dig into that a little bit more, but that's my first response to that. I thought his meditations on the relationship between curiosity and discipline were significant. He talks about, he says, free curiosity is more value in learning than harsh discipline. And so, he talks about how, he had such harsh discipline that, he didn't get his Greek right or whatever, and he gets beaten for it. And that people were cruel to him. They were unjust. They didn't do the right thing. At the same time, however, he doesn't allow himself to be treated as a victim. He doesn't treat himself as a victim. Well, he'll say that, yeah, people were unjust toward me in the way that they treated me, my schoolmasters and whoever else. And ultimately, like I messed up and, I wasn't a perfect student. And so he's primarily owning up to his own injustices rather than that which is committed against him. So that right there, I think is significant in the way that he's framing the own injustice that he suffered, that he's focusing in on what he was able to control and not so much on the broader misfortune brought against him. Um, it's a very pre-modern. It's almost a stoic way of approaching your experience. That I'm not going to identify with the fortune that is dealt to me. I'm going to identify with the way that I'm responding to fortune. And so that alone, I think, is a very ennobling way to view your life and your relationship to the world around you. But more specifically to the point where I was headed with that is when he says that free curiosity is of more value in learning than harsh discipline. But by your ordinance, O God, discipline must control the free play of curiosity. For your ordinance ranges from the master's cane to the torment suffered by the martyrs, and works that mingling of bitter with sweet, which brings us back to you from the poison of pleasure that first drew us away from you. And so he said curiosity is very important in learning, but at the same time, that's got to be led by discipline. It has to be willing to receive discipline because free curiosity alone can just lead you into wild places of isolation. The right kind of curiosity leads us to the truth, and ultimately, the truth is God. But that requires discipline and requires receiving the discipline that's brought against you. That's something I'd underlined here and continue to meditate on.
I think a couple of things really stood out to me from reading that and then responding to your analysis there. The first is that I think it's so interesting that even though a lot of people trace back the development of Calvinist or Reformed theology to Augustine, I think rightfully so, as a Calvinist myself, I I like the fact that he has this approach that doesn't focus the locus of control on someone else. Like, even though he acknowledges that God is in control of everything, that everything from beatings at school to martyrdom from wicked authorities, they're under God's ordinance. He controls them, He is all knowing of them. It is still our responsibility to do the right thing. It is our responsibility to make our life, a service to God, to act in a way instead of just, oh, what happens will happen. We can't do anything about it, so we must just accept what may come. He does say we must accept what may come, but then he says, and you must pursue the love of God. You must do the right thing. You must love truth, beauty, and goodness. And the other thing that really struck me was this kind of understanding of children's psychology and educational psychology that I think does feel quite modern in some ways. The idea of you need to have a balance of curiosity and discipline. You can't just make a student love learning. You have to inspire that curiosity. You have to guide the curiosity. And I thought that felt like a really modern psychological insight to me.
Yeah, definitely. That the educational system or the schoolmasters or whoever, that you can't force somebody to learn. And ultimately learning is it's about conforming yourself to the way that things are. And so there's always an existential element to that. And so that can't be simply forced. It has to be accepted. Um, and that on one hand is a fairly modern idea, but also it's very Socratic, right? When you consider the way that Socrates educated people in his philosophy, he engaged them, he asked them questions rather than forcing ideas on them. I mean, I think compulsion has its place in certain contexts, like to maintain order and whatnot. But as far as real education goes, education of the person, education of the soul, this Socratic model, this Platonic model is one of inquiry that draws people further up and further in, right? To borrow a phrase from Lewis, which is a very Platonic phrase. And so Augustine is definitely continuing in that idea that we need to help people to recognize their natural desires being the desires that are placed into us by nature, which Augustine says clearly, ultimately, is the desire for God, which again, very Platonic idea, that all men by nature desire the good. Um, the problem is that we tend to value lesser goods over the ultimate good, and that's where we go wrong. But we all do have this natural desire for the good, this natural desire for God. And real education is going to help to uncover different avenues of that natural desire that we have by virtue of being made in God's image. So yeah, I think that is an important point that, on one hand, sounds very modern, but also in a way that is deeply rooted in truth, in a way that modernism largely is not.
No, definitely. I remember when I taught sixth grade at a classical school one year, and I told the sixth graders, I said, the world's going to tell you need to follow your passions. I was like, I'm here to tell you you're not here. You shouldn't follow your passions. And they're like, what do you mean? Right? Like, and like, I would explain to them, like, well, not all passions are good. Not all passions are good. Some are, but some can be bad.
Correct. And real education is a matter of learning how to separate the good from the bad, learning how you know, to again discard superficial passions to find what it is that you ultimately desire as a human. Um, and that discovery really does work best as discovery. I mean, I can in my on campus classes again at a state university philosophy, all of my students, almost all of them, 90% of them would tell me on day one that pretty much everything is just made up. Truth, goodness, beauty, it's all just artificial constructs, just sort of put out there in the world. Um, but then, I'll ask them questions. Primarily, this is when I get to Plato, when I start going through the Euthyphro dialogue, where Socrates is asking the question, basically, what makes good things good? What is real piety? And in that dialogue, Euthyphro, Socrates' conversation partner, says, that, okay, the good is, this, what I'm doing right now in pursuing justice. And Socrates says, okay, what are some other good things? Euthyphro throws some stuff out there. And then eventually he comes to the realization that Socrates is asking him the question, what is the good that makes good things good? And now when I bring that to my students and I ask them, okay, tell me some good things. And they'll throw out things like, justice is good, being nice to people is good. I mean, whatever is, popular virtues of the day. Charity is good. I say, yep, okay, all those things are great. Now, what do you mean when you call all these things good? And at that point, they just get quiet and look at me like confused and kind of upset and kind of nervous. It's like at that point, they're starting to recognize the problem here that, a little bit earlier in the lesson, they told me there is no such thing as goodness. Now they just told me all these good things. And, and so, by kind of stoking that conversation, it helps them to recognize that I actually want goodness, but my current philosophy can't account for what that is. And I think that very Socratic model, in this case, literally a Socratic model using one of Plato's dialogues, it's a way to help to sort of just push aside all this overgrowth that lays on top of the natural desire that we all have to, you know, to love God and to to serve Him, to know Him, to worship Him, to glory in Him. And so, that's something that like we naturally want, but we also fight against. As you know, Aslan says, oh Adam's sons, how hard you fight against everything that brings you joy, something like that. And I think that's absolutely the case, and I find that very practical terms in my own education experience.
If I could pick up on something that Ian was saying earlier, I liked the comment that when you read what Augustine's writing here, that there really is no room for blaming anyone else for his own condition. He's pointing the finger right at himself. And that's interesting when you think about it in terms of him being proto-Calvinistic or whatever term we want to use. In some ways, he's almost very obliquely rebuking the hyper Calvinists who wouldn't really show up on the scene for another 1,200 years or so. But he's saying, look, it's all me. It's not God's decree that makes me evil in any sense that I can blame. God is good. I'm the evil one. If I'm outside of His will, outside of His favor, that's all me. Don't look anywhere else. Don't try to blame Him, His ways, anything. And that humility is really what I think we all could aspire to that in terms of just coming before God and saying, we have nothing to bring, and in addition, we're not only just zero, we're at net negative here, so we need you.
Yeah, exactly. Like nobody can read Augustine's Confessions or Augustine at large and say that he's somebody who rejected his own agency by any means, right? He is very much interested in his own agency and its misuse as well as its positive use carried by grace. And in fact, we mentioned Calvin a few times, which it's hard for us to read Augustine and not mention Calvin because of some obvious connections. But I mean, it's worth noting that Calvin himself, if you read the Institutes, he sounds very existentialist at times, very, well, Augustinian. That a lot of times he is treated, even by those who claim to be Calvinists, who have never actually read Calvin, that he's treated as sort of this cold-hearted Stoic, which he absolutely is not. And in fact, outside of Scripture, Augustine's number one place for quotations is Augustine. And so he is, in fact, I would go as far as to say that if you don't have Augustine, not only would Catholicism be very different, but I don't know that you would have a Protestant Reformation in the way that it was established. I mean, Luther himself is an Augustinian monk. Calvin is constantly referencing Augustine. And so, again, you can't read Luther and say that, he's somebody who ignored his own agency. He very much obsessed over his sin as Augustine did. You can't really read Calvin and say that he denies his own agency. He absolutely embraces it. But it's the kind of agency that recognizes every good thing comes from God. That doesn't leave my autonomy in a very good position, but does leave my base existence in a very good position. Because that means if I exist, then I am sustained by goodness if only I am willing to embrace it. Um, yeah, yeah. I just love how powerful he phrases things. Like looking toward the beginning of book two here, where now he's really getting into his confession proper, right? This is when he's really getting into his specific sins here. And as sort of leading up to that, at the beginning of section one here of book two, he says, arrived now at adolescence, I burned for all the satisfactions of hell, and I sank to the animal in a succession of dark lusts. My beauty consumed away, and I stank in thine eyes, yet was pleasing in my own, and anxious to please the eyes of men. And so he talks about how I burn for all the satisfactions of hell. And so he recognizes the that he actually I mean desired his misery, ultimately speaking. And that's what sin is. It's a desiring of our own misery. And he talks about how he sank to the animal, which is very much a drawing on of classical philosophy. You know, Plato will talk about this, Aristotle will talk about this, how we have we have something in common with the beast, our base desires for food, for pleasure, for pack dominance, for sex, whatever. We have these things in common with the animals, but what makes us different is that we have, as Aristotle would say, a rational soul. We have this ability to aspire to be something more than that. And what matters first and foremost is not even so much where you're located, but where it is that you're headed, what it is that you're directed toward. And that sort of feeds back into also what's pulling you. And so, in his rejection of his true nature in relationship to God. It says, I sank down into the animal. He's descending down, as Boethius is going to tell us a little bit later, that, basically the higher you are, I mean, the deeper you can fall. And so, he's actually worse than the animal. He's downright something demonic at this point, which is why Augustine connects himself with the desires of hell. Um, and so it's just, I don't really have a whole lot to say beyond what Augustine is saying, but I just think he does a great job of demonstrating the stakes that are at play, that nothing in the understood within the cosmic order should be taken lightly.
This kind of goes a little bit with what you're saying. This is just a footnote at the end of book one, where it's talking about the passage outlining Augustine's theology of desire. The appetite for physical pleasure is ultimately a groaning for happiness in God, and thus the attempt to satisfy it with created goods, and so the creator ends in sorrow rather than joy. Just the way that he had set it up in the passage um, just makes it clear to me for sure. Andrew, you're muted.
Yeah, you're muted. Oops.
Sorry, I was looking at a different screen. All right. Yeah, it reminds me of this line from Lewis's Paralandra, where he says, and though there seemed to be, and indeed were, 1,000 roads by which a man could walk through the world, there was not a single one which did not lead, sooner or later, to the beatific or miserific vision. That every step we take is headed toward a direction, and ultimately, move toward the end. It's going to be one opposing direction versus the other. That all things are naturally moving back toward their source in the goodness of God, or they're moving away from that source, which is a way of approaching nothingness. It's why in sort of the medieval cosmological order, like you get in Dante, why hell is frozen over, because on one hand it obviously exists, but it's sort of approaching nothingness in its movement away from God, and so for that reason it's stagnant as sort of an imitation of the eternality of God. But ultimately all things are moving either toward rest in God or this artificial rest of stagnation in hell. And I think that that's a good way of framing reality and where all paths ultimately lead. Um, yes, I think that philosophy of desire is definitely significant.
I love how he ends book two. I don't know if we're there yet, but I don't know if I can do that or not. But he ends it saying, "Whoso enters into thee," I don't know what translation this is, just the one I found on Hoopla. But whoso enters into thee enters into the joy of his Lord. He shall not fear and shall do excellently in the all excellent. Very good. And just acknowledging his own sin and the sin of his youth, which he calls lust, basically. Yeah, acknowledging it, but then going to God, he's like, I find rest in you.
Mhm.
You know, I might be sinful, but you are good.
Mhm. Right. That he was led astray by various desires, but in God he finds his ultimate desire. He finds true satisfaction as opposed to the vain satisfactions that he sought elsewhere. And it um it just really shows us in Augustine that the pathway of spiritual discipline, the pathway of God, obviously it requires sacrifice. It requires turning away things that you might very much enjoy, but it's a turning away of ultimately lesser joys for the ultimate beatific joy. It's a sacrifice of the lesser for the greater. And I don't think that's an exchange that anyone would truly regret. Um, Now, looking back a little bit before that section, he's referring back to signposts along the way. And so, leading up to the pair situation, he says that, already he at 16, when he comes, back home, that he's engaged in all these, these indulgent activities. And his mom is cautioning him about some of this, saying, "Look, okay, don't sleep around, especially with another man's wife." Meanwhile, his essentially pagan father is just saying, "All right, be a man and go do whatever you want to," and um, kind of I don't know, kind of a weird. I don't know if this is normal, but kind of weird section where he says like I was at the Roman baths with my dad. He said I see that you're becoming a man. Now go forth and do stuff with that. And he says that his mom was like cautioning about that. He says all that to me sounded like womanish advice, and so he just totally dismissed her. But now looking back, he recognizes that this was the voice of God, that he thought that God was silent during all this time as he's indulging in his various fleshly desires, but God was very much speaking. He was just ignoring her. He was ignoring, God speaking through his mother. Um, it's in in my on-campus class, was teaching a course called Life, Death, and Meaning, and I made the students read "Till We Have Faces" by C.S. Lewis. And toward the end, one of the students is talking about how if God really existed, there'd be signs everywhere and blah, et cetera, et cetera. And why would he hide himself? And my response to that is that a sign is of no help to the blind. And in this case, the willfully blind, or at least someone who has their eyes shut. Maybe it'd be a better way of framing that to demonstrate the agency here. And so he recognizes like there were signs everywhere. He just didn't want to see them. And so again, it comes down to the will rather than anything else. It wasn't God mistreating him by not giving him wisdom here. He just didn't want it. And so again, agency is entirely on his part here.
We have a collect in the Anglican tradition, of which I'm a part of, that, and it actually comes from Augustine. And we say, "O God, who art the author of peace and lover of concord and knowledge, of whom standeth our eternal life, whose service is perfect freedom." Really telling their service being perfect freedom, freedom and service, service to the ultimate good. That is God.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's see, a little bit later here in book two, he talks about, in trying to really get at the nature of sin, he talks about, disordered loves, that we love the lesser over the greater. And he says that, these lower things, whatever it is that we might love other than God, like these things might be good. They have their delights, but not such as God has. For he made them all, and in him doth righteousness delight, and he is the joy of the upright heart. And so it's not even so much that we have to sacrifice the lesser delights for the greater, but when you recognize the greater delight, the lessers actually become greater as they are understood in context of the greater. And so, you look for earth and you lose heaven. Look for heaven and you gain earth in the process. Um, and so there's so much delight to be had. There's so much desire to be had, but it really comes down to maintaining the proper order. You love the greater over the lesser, and in so doing, you actually love the lesser even more. And this idea that this very Platonic idea that everyone by nature serves the good. We find that in his analysis of the pear incident, when he's talking about how, the pears weren't even that great. We didn't even really eat them. We just fed them to the pigs. And so he's trying to figure out, why did I even do this thing? And he says, okay, well, maybe it's because I just love companionship. So maybe it's a love of friendship, which I mean, that's a good thing. Or, but he really just comes down on, I loved it because it was wrong. That's really his leading idea, that I just wanted to do what was wrong. But even that is a perverted kind of way of wanting to do what is right, because he recognized some good that he was serving, right? And the problem there is, well, it was totally inverted. As he said at the beginning of this book, he was pursuing the satisfaction of hell rather than of heaven. And so just totally inverted, hence his need for conversion. Right. Well,
Takes a
this
lot.
was, yeah,
Sorry.
no,
It
go
takes,
ahead.
it's, for me, it takes a lot to actually admit that, though, I think. That, Confessions is such a deeply personal text. He's like, I loved it because it was wrong, right? Like, now many people would probably try to find, another excuse, but he actually, I wasn't even hungry, but I just did it because it was wrong. Really interesting.
Right. And so he really places sin in the, well, in the will, in the desire, which is tied to the will. It's what matters first and foremost is where we're being directed. And this is one area where some people think that he's, a little bit, too extreme, because, he's not first and foremost concerned with his actions. He's first and foremost concerned with the desires that produce the actions. And this brings us to the kind of the depth psychology angle, that he's very much concerned with what is motivating him. But then even deeper than that, what he is allowing to motivate him, where he is directing himself, where he is moving his will. And I don't know, I think that is actually, it's very helpful. I mean, how many times have you done something that you know is wrong? Right? Whatever it may be. We all do stuff that we know is wrong. You do something you know is wrong, and you might feel guilty about that. And you might think, okay, why did I do that? Why would I do that? How could I do such a thing? But you're so much focused on the action that you don't stop and think, what did I actually want here? And why did I want it? Because until you recognize how corrupted your desires are, then that root issue is never actually going to change, because you won't know exactly what it is that you need to repent of. And what we see in Augustine is somebody who recognizes, what I don't need first and foremost is to modify my behavior. What I need first and foremost is a new will. I need to be sanctified. And so, his reliance on grace kind of simultaneously, allows him to not work so hard, but also he has to work so hard because he recognizes, how much is wrong in him, how much has to be overcome. But at the same time, he's able to just receive. And so it's the kind of grace that spurs activity. But again, it comes down to recognizing how kind of unfruitful his autonomous will is. And I think that if we're honest, a lot of times we're not willing to get down to that level. We're willing to repent of actions, not so much willing to repent of our own being.
Yeah, it's one thing to resist an action that you know is bad. It's another thing to try to change the whole makeup, like the I don't even know how to put it. You know what I mean? Like, just to the desire to do that thing, right? Like that very thing itself. It's one other thing. Like, you can resist that, but the fact that that's even there.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That we can't by ourselves just replace our desires.
Yeah, and Augustine would say, like, he can't do either. It's through God's grace.
Hmm. Exactly. Anything else anyone want to bring up from these first two books? I mean, these first two books. I mean, there's definitely some philosophy here, but I mean, we're largely setting up the orientation of what we're doing here. Moving forward, as he recounts his own philosophical and spiritual journey, I think that we'll have more. I mean, more, well, theology and philosophy to work through here. But Definitely a powerful introduction that helps us to recognize that this is not first and foremost an academic philosophy text. This is first and foremost um, somebody wrestling with his relationship with God, and somebody who has been through great sin, but somebody who has experienced great grace. And so I think that is something that resonates, hopefully, with all of us. And I trust that as we move further along with Augustine's own journey here through his life, that we'll experience some of that ourselves, hopefully on a deeper level than we have so far. So unless there's anything else I want to bring up, I think I'll just end with the final section here from book two. Who can unravel that complex, twisted knottedness? It is unclean. I hate to think of it or look at it. I long for thee, O justice and innocence, joy and beauty of the clear of sight. I long for thee with unquenchable longing. There is sure repose in thee, and life untroubled. He that enters into thee enters into the joy of the Lord, and shall not fear, and shall be well in him, who is the best. I went away from thee, my God. In my youth I strayed too far from thy sustaining power, and I became to myself a barren land. And so, great celebration in the goodness, the joy, and the beauty of the Lord, but also a solemn recognition of the barrenness of rejecting that joy that's ever before us. I think it gives us a good place to wrap up our introduction here. And I hope that you all, and I think maybe a few others, will come in next time as we cover books 3 and 4. So I hope to see you in a couple weeks. So we're meeting every other week. And so hopefully I'll see you again on the 12th at the same time. All right, until then, Godspeed. All right, thank you for listening. And as we move forward, please make sure that you enroll in some of our upcoming courses. I have a brief history of ideas coming up that starts the week of the 18th. Hannah Gilmore's Intro to Latin course, or her introductory Latin course, begins the week of the 11th, as does Josh Traylor's Paradise Lost. And so you can find links in the notes here, the show notes, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on the podcast. And so click those links, go ahead and enroll. And as a reminder, Mythic Mind patrons get a 50% discount on courses from any other fellowship creators. And before we go, I do want to give a quick thank you to all my patrons, and by name, all of the Tier 3 patrons and higher. So many thanks to Mark, Amanda, Chase, Chaz, Clinton, Aaron, Evie, Jamie, Justin, Kyle, Paul, Roger, Tyler, and William. All of you, as well as all of my Tier 1 and 2 patrons, help me to keep moving forward in putting together courses, putting together podcasts, putting together all the various things that we are up to. Also, we have just started our Star Wars series, and so you can probably already find on YouTube the live stream conversation that we had. Find a link to my YouTube channel in the show notes, and then that'll also be coming through the podcast feed next time. But that's it for now, and until next time, Godspeed. When you go to the roots of the word philosophy, you find the love of wisdom, which unfortunately is not what you find at the roots of all who call themselves philosophers. Now, how do we get here? What are the ideas that shape our world, and what can the old world tell us in response to the perennial questions of what it means to be human, what is our purpose, and what, if anything, ought we aspire to? In a brief history of ideas, we will navigate major epics of thought and survey some of the most important figures in the Western canon, including Plato, Aristotle, Boethius, Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, Descartes, Nietzsche, Sartre, and Kierkegaard. And of course, we will consider even more names, but these are the thinkers that will supply our primary readings. Each week will include primary sources that will be provided as PDFs, although these are all texts that do belong in your personal library. You'll be recommended some secondary texts, you'll be provided with some recorded presentations for you to watch at your leisure, ongoing Discord chats, and weekly live meetings to discuss the readings. I've been teaching philosophy for many years, and I can say with confidence that you will leave this 6-week course with a better understanding of the foundations of Western thought than most contemporary philosophy majors. Enroll today by going to patreon.com/mythicmind and checking out the shop, or you can gain access to all courses, past, present, and any course that begins during the term of your subscription by purchasing a Tier 3 annual subscription. So again, purchase a Tier 3 annual subscription, and I'll give you a special code that gives you access to all courses that either have taken place or do start in this term. And I sincerely hope to see you there.